Greetings, everyone. Today's presentation is about the design of the future and the future of design. So these are two interrelated, connected things, but we'll talk about both of them separately as a part of this conversation. So let's first talk about the design of the future. So one of the things designers do overall, whether they are product designers, graphic designers, architects, interior designers, etc., one of the things that they do is they look at current conditions, they look at the needs of people as they exist right now. And when they design something, and when that something that's been designed goes out into the world, when it converts from an idea into a tangible product, or when it converts from a concept into a building, it actually happens in the future. So you might be designing something now, but it goes out into the world a few months, a few years, a few decades down the road. So designers are always designing for the future. So if you think about that, one of the things that designers do is they imagine existing conditions, but they're actually designing for the future. So in a sense, you can see design as an activity that creates potential futures for us all. So that's one thing that designers do. We look at current conditions and imagine what the future could look like. So all sketches, all prototypes, all renderings, all the visual expressions that you see from designers are in some sense scenarios of what the future could look like. So very often we hear about two things, technology and society. And very often we imagine that technology is a force that changes society. Technology changes society to lead us to future conditions. That's a dangerous way of thinking. We cannot think purely in terms of technology as a driver of human society. It's important to think in circular ways. So just as technology can drive certain social conditions, social behaviors, similarly, it is social conditions and people who drive technology. So the relationship between technology and society is a mutual relationship. Right? It's not that one drives the other, it's that both influence each other, moving us forward. So one thing to keep in mind is not to imagine the fact that digital technologies will really transform who we are. Yes, they will. But similarly, we, by being who we are, will transform digital technology as well. So the future conditions depend upon us as social beings and also depend upon us as creators of new futures. And as you think of designers as creators of potential new futures, one person that comes to mind who has been thinking about this quite a bit is a designer and actually someone who's referred to as a visual futurist, Sid Mead. And what you see in this rendering, this illustration, is one potential imagined future that Sid Mead came up with. And Sid Mead is a transportation designer, so he's known for his amazing designs of vehicles. He designs sets for scientific fiction movies. He has done a series of these environmental graphics, renderings, presentations about the future. So he's referred to as a visual futurist. And in this quote, you can hear him saying, in visual futurism, the line between total fantasy, so what you might imagine the future to look like, and what's futuristic is a thread of reality. So any imagined future essentially is how you, as a human being in the current time, imagine the reality to be in the future. So it's a thread that connects the now to the future, the present to the future, right? And so Sid Mead has done an enormous amount of work in thinking about what those potential futures could look like. If you have seen the movie Blade Runner, Sid Mead was responsible for the design of the sets of Blade Runner. He was responsible for the design of the vehicles that are seen in the movie. And so what you see here in this illustration, this rendering, is a sketch of the vehicle that was referred to as the spinner. So you can see that he has imagined what these future conditions could look like, what transportation of the future could look like, and that's what he's expressed in these drawings. You see some more renderings as well. You can see entire cities with people wearing certain kinds of clothing, vehicles, transportation mechanisms, all on a very large scale in this landscape. You see people standing, you can see people's clothing as well. So in a sense, it's an expression of future conditions from the perspective of what we will wear, what we will drive, how we will live, and what our environment could look like in the future. Being a transportation designer, he has spent quite a bit of time thinking about the vehicles of the future. What could those look like? And here you see some examples of some potential transportation design concepts. And this is also another sketch of his, which is an imagined landscape for an entire city, an urban environment, and its relationship to nature. So you see some of these really incredible expressions of what the world could look like in the future by these visual futurists and designers who imagine what the material landscape would look like a few years, decades, or centuries down the road. So that is one aspect of design. So the process of design actually is about imagining what future could look like. On the other hand, one of the things we can do in this presentation is think about, okay, so we know that design in some sense plays a very important role in shaping our future, right? So the design of the future. But what about the future of design itself? How will the practice of design change in the future, right? We know how product design, graphic design, architectural design, landscape design, interior design, etc., how they operate now, but how could design itself change in the future? So let's look at some of the changing conditions that we see right now that could shape the future of design. So the one thing that's been happening, one thing that designers are thinking about is what is the role that design plays in practices of innovation, right? So very often companies think of innovation in very, very broad terms. They think of innovation as any new ideas that can be productized, that can be marketed, that can be sold, and bring some form of value, right? And that value is value to people, value to the company, financial value, as well as social value, environmental value. So value is really important in sort of some of these definitions of innovation. So what role does design play? And there's more and more conversation about the fact that the way designers think, the way designers practice their craft, the practice of design itself can play a really important role in engaging other disciplines and making innovation real. So that's one really important way by which design is changing. It's playing a broader, deeper, and more important role in the practice of innovation. Another thing is the prominence of this whole area that's referred to as design thinking. And we've talked about this in this class before. Design thinking can be broken down to several different components, including everything from being empathic to the people that you're designing for, to being collaborative, to being at ease with ambiguity. So this diagram essentially shows all of the different aspects or components of what design thinking could be like. But there is recognition, especially in the business world, about the fact that designers have a unique way of thinking. And that unique way of thinking can be really beneficial in a very broad sense about how an organization operates, what an institution does, how a company behaves. And so it's an important piece of what design does now, and it will continue to be so into the future as well. Another really important thing, this is happening quite a bit all over the world, is something that's referred to as the maker movement and the DIY movement. So the maker movement essentially refers to people who like to make things and are more energized and empowered by various things happening in society at the moment that allow them to be successful at making things. People who have ideas, who've launched companies. The DIY movement, essentially DIY refers to do it yourself. So people who, instead of going out and buying products that are off the shelf, they want to make things themselves. They also want to make things for themselves, but also to be able to create a new business, to be able to sell them to others, other like-minded people. So there is an enormous groundswell in the world right now about people who want to make things themselves, people who don't want to buy things off the shelf, and have several things happening that we'll talk about in just a moment around them in society that actually enables them and empowers them to do so. One of those things is referred to as desktop manufacturing, also referred to as additive manufacturing, also referred to as rapid prototyping, also sometimes referred to as 3D printing. So what this refers to is the prevalence and the availability at very low cost, relatively low cost, of machines that can be used for rapid prototyping, machines that you can feed a computer file to, a CAD file to, a virtual solid model to, and it will create a part for you, right? So there's quite a bit of this happening these days. You can buy these 3D printers and rapid prototyping machines for fairly low cost. And so what this has done is it has given people the ability to build things themselves. So if you have some software program, if you can create a virtual model on the computer of a product that you're interested in or are interested in designing or interested in manufacturing, you can actually create that model and have it built by machines like these at your home, right? So this whole idea of desktop manufacturing, that you don't need massive factories to make things, as long as they are simple and not too complicated, you can actually make some of these things at home. So these new technologies of rapid prototyping have made it easier for people to be able to make things themselves, and that is one of the things that is fueling the DIY and the maker movement today. Another important thing that we see these days is this notion of crowdfunding. What does that mean? One of the things that's become really easy these days, or become a lot easier these days, is to get funding for your projects by reaching out to a broad range of people. So there are companies like Kickstarter, for example, who allow you and encourage you, if you have an idea for a new product, but you don't have the money to actually take it to market, you can present this in the form of a video, explanation, etc. on the Kickstarter website. What it does is it sends this out to a broad range of people who can then access that website, who can access your video, who can see what you've done. And if they find that interesting, they can invest in your idea. So a large crowd can fund your project. And these are strangers, these are people who you don't know. But through access to that website, you can actually able to raise money from a large number of people. And that crowdsourcing, crowdfunding model has made it easier for people without any funding to support themselves to create these new businesses, new markets, and new products, new companies. So that's another thing. One thing that will become more important as we move forward is this whole idea of sustainability. Yeah, we know that we only have one planet on which we live, and we have to make sure that this one planet that is sustaining life for us as human beings, but also life for all the plants and animals, all organisms, all living things on this planet. We only have one of these planets, and we have to make sure that we do not destroy this planet, that we have to engage in the right kinds of behaviors by design to make sure that we minimize environmental impact, we clean up our oceans, we reduce the pollution, and we take care of the planet in as many ways as we possibly can, because it's the only one we have. So sustainability will become more important in several ways. Number one, it'll become more important because consumers will ask for it. Consumers will want to have products that are more sustainable. Another thing that will happen is there'll be more regulations. There'll be more regulations from governments, from regulating bodies, to ensure that companies, individuals, designers, engineers, business people do not harm the environment more than they already have, but actually keep it in check. So more demand from consumers and more regulations from regulating bodies will be two really important things that will drive sustainability in the world. So that's one other really important factor to consider in the future of design. The way design happens today, it's entirely global. So things could be designed in one part of the world by one designer. They could be prototyped in another part of the world. They could be manufactured in a third part of the world, warehoused in a fourth part of the world, and sold in a fifth part of the world. So this is not unusual for companies to have multiple satellite locations, vendors, long supply chains, distributed supply chains, where things are designed, conceptualized, manufactured, stored, sold all over the world. This is a model that exists right now, and it will only continue to happen more so in the future. Because what companies are trying to find is where is the best, cheapest, most affordable, fastest way for me to get products made, right? And that will continue. At the same time, though, there's more and more emphasis on thinking about the local. The problem with being global is that you have to engage in enormous amounts of transportation. If I'm designing something in California and getting it manufactured in China, there is an enormous amount of transportation that happens, right, between the two countries. And that leads to pollution, that leads to environmental impacts, and therefore, one of the things that is being talked about is the idea of making things locally using local materials and local sources. That cuts down tremendously the amount of environmental impact that we might have by cutting out the transportation. But the other important thing it does is it provides local employment. So being local has two really important benefits. One is the social benefit. It provides employment. It keeps funds. It keeps money in the community itself. And second, because it cuts down on transportation, it minimizes environmental impact substantially. So we will have global, But with that in mind, we'll also have lots of emphasis on the local, such as things like farmers markets or local farmers. It's important for us to buy produce that is made, the fruits and vegetables that are grown in our neighborhood rather than getting them shipped from halfway across the world, right? So there'll be an emphasis on the global and the local together. What we can do locally, we should. What we have to rely on globally, we will. And that's, I think, one important trend that will continue to happen in the world of design. Another thing that's really important is that of transdisciplinarity. In the future, we will be tackling, addressing, solving problems that will be a lot more complex than we see today. The problems also will accelerate a lot faster than we see today. And for that, we have to work in teams. And this is an example of something that we are doing at Arizona State University. We have students working in teams from business, from design, from sustainability, from graphics, from engineering. And together, we come up with solutions for the problems that we are solving right now. And one really, really important thing is to think of this notion of thinking in systems. We have to realize that any one thing that you do in the world could have lasting, unexpected consequences elsewhere in the world. It's like dropping a rock in a pond. You have these ripples that emanate, and those ripples could go from the center of the lake to the shores of the lake. And that is an impact that we have to consider. Therefore, if you think in systems, if you recognize that everything is interconnected, you drop one thing here, it has impacts over there, it'll force you to think, it'll help you to think in systems, and therefore, when you design something new, you'll keep in mind the fact that it could have lasting impact somewhere completely unexpected and far away from you, where you are right now. So what we've done in this talk is we've looked at two key things. We've looked at the design of the future. Essentially what that means is that designers, when they come up with new ideas, they're being sent out into the future. Anything that you design now can only be realized into the future. So that's one aspect of design. And the second thing we looked at was the future of design. The profession of design itself. How is it changing? And what are some of the key factors that'll change design for the future? Thank you very much.